May 3, 1943. Field Hospital 28, Tunisia. The blood-soaked nurse stared at the empty supply cart, then at the 47 dying men on canvas cots. No gauze, no bandages, no supplies for 6 more hours. She had 3 rolls of cloth for 107 wounded soldiers. By morning 20 men would be dead, unless she found something, anything. She walked into the darkness toward the salvage area, where broken equipment went to die. 3 minutes later, she pulled a torn parachute from under a canvas tarp. Her hands started cutting. Within 90 days, her silly improvisation would save 10,000 soldiers and change military medicine forever. But that night, she just needed to save one man. May 3, 1943. Field Hospital 28, 12 miles south of Bandage, Tunisia. The canvas walls of the surgical tent rippled in the hot wind that carried sand and the smell of diesel fuel from the supply trucks. Lieutenant Sarah Chen had been on her feet for 19 hours straight. The blood on her white nurse's uniform had dried to a dark rust color in some places, and was still wet in others. Her hands moved mechanically, unwrapping the gauze from Private Morrison's thigh wound for the 4th time that shift. The bandage came away soaked through, useless. Morrison didn't make a sound. He'd stopped making sounds around hour 3. His face had gone the color of old newspaper. Sarah pressed fresh gauze against the wound, applied pressure, counted to 30, released. Blood welled up immediately, flowing around her fingers like water from a broken dam. She reached for another roll of gauze from the supply cart. The cart was nearly empty. There were 47 men in this tent alone. Another tent beyond this one held 60 more. The supply convoy that was supposed to arrive yesterday hadn't come. The one before that had been hit by German artillery outside Tunis. Sarah wrapped the new gauze around Morrison's leg, pulling it tight enough to make him wince. She tied it off, checked the clock mounted on the center tent pole. 11:47 p.m. She gave the bandage 6 hours before it would need changing again, if they had enough gauze left by then. If Morrison lasted that long, she moved to the next cot. Corporal Davis, shrapnel wounds across his back and shoulders. She'd already changed his dressings twice. The gauze came away pink and wet. She reached for the supply cart again. Her hand closed on empty air. The last roll was gone. Behind her, someone coughed. A wet, rattling sound. She turned, 3 cots down. A sergeant whose name she hadn't learned yet was trying to sit up. The bandage around his chest had come loose, unwinding like a broken watch spring. Dark blood spread across the white sheets beneath him. Sarah's stomach dropped. She looked at the empty supply cart. She looked at the 47 men in the tent. She looked at Major Holland, the chief surgeon who was hunched over an operating table in the corner, his hands deep inside a soldier's abdomen, trying to tie off a bleeder, before the man's blood pressure dropped to nothing. Holland hadn't slept in 36 hours. None of them had. The morphine was running low. The plasma was running low. The sulfur powder was running low. And now the gauze was gone. Sarah walked to the supply tent. The canvas flap hung loose, snapping in the wind. Inside, the wooden crates that should have been stacked 6 high stood empty, their lids pried off and discarded. She found 3 rolls of gauze in the bottom of the last crate. 3 rolls. For 107 wounded men. For wounds that needed changing every 4 to 8 hours. For bleeding that wouldn't stop. She carried the 3 rolls back to the surgical tent. She set them on the supply cart. She stared at them for a long moment. The tent flap opened. Corporal Jenkins limped in, supporting a private who'd taken a bullet through the shoulder during a night patrol. Fresh blood dripped onto the dirt floor. Sarah grabbed one of the 3 remaining rolls. She unwrapped it. She pressed it against the private's shoulder. The white gauze turned red in seconds. She kept pressing, kept counting, kept hoping the bleeding would slow. It didn't. She wrapped the wound anyway, using half the roll to get enough layers to absorb what was coming through. That left 2.5 rolls. For 108 men. Jenkins helped the private onto an empty cot near the entrance. Sarah checked on Morrison. His bandage was soaked through again. It had been less than 3 hours. She didn't have enough gauze to change it. She pressed her hand against the dressing, applied direct pressure, held it there while Morrison's eyes rolled back. and his breathing went shallow. Major Holland finished at the operating table. He pulled off his rubber gloves, dropped them in a metal pan, walked over to the supply cart. He looked at the 2 remaining rolls of gauze. He looked at Sarah. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. They both knew what it meant. The convoy was supposed to arrive at dawn. That was 7 hours away. In 7 hours, with the wounds they had, with the bleeding that wouldn't stop, they'd lose 15 men, maybe 20, maybe more. Sarah had done the math. She'd done it 3 times to make sure. The numbers didn't change. Holland picked up one of the rolls. He carried it to a corporal with a head wound. The bandage around the man's skull had turned completely red. Holland started unwrapping it. The tent flap opened again. 2 medics carried in a stretcher. Another casualty from the night patrol. Chest wound. Sucking chest wound. The worst kind. The medic was holding a field dressing against the hole, trying to keep air from getting into the lung cavity. His hands were shaking. Holland moved fast. He grabbed the last roll of gauze, tore open a pack of petroleum jelly, smeared it on the gauze, pressed it over the wound. The soldier on the stretcher gasped, coughed, gasped again. Holland held the dressing in place, counted to 60, then started wrapping what was left of the gauze around the man's torso. He used every inch. When he was done, the supply cart was empty. Sarah looked at the clock. 12:23 a.m. Dawn was still 6 hours away. Morrison's bandage was soaking through again. She could see the red spreading across the white gauze like spilled wine. Davis was bleeding through his dressings. The sergeant with the chest wound had given up trying to sit up. He lay flat, staring at the canvas ceiling, his breathing rapid and shallow. Sarah walked outside. The desert stretched away in every direction, flat and empty under a sky full of stars. Somewhere out there, a convoy was driving through the darkness, carrying crates of medical supplies. Somewhere out there, German forces were regrouping, planning their next attack. Somewhere out there, men were dying. Because she'd run out of gauze, she stood in the sand, feeling the wind against her face, listening to the distant rumble of artillery fire to the north. Her hands were still covered in blood. Morrison's blood, Davis's blood, the blood of 47 men, who needed her to figure out how to keep them alive until dawn. She went back inside. Present day, Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, Bethesda, Maryland. Dr. James Morrison walked through the medical museum on the hospital's 3rd floor. He stopped at a display case. Inside was a piece of white silk, aged, yellowed, carefully preserved, behind glass. The placard read, "Parachute Silk Bandage, developed by Captain Sarah Chen, Army Nurse Corps, 1943. This innovation saved an estimated 50,000 lives during World War II and formed the foundation for modern hemostatic wound dressing." Morrison stared at the silk. His grandfather had been wrapped in material just like this. Private First Class David Morrison, wounded in Tunisia, saved by a nurse who'd run out of supplies, and improvised. His grandfather had told him the story dozens of times, how he'd been bleeding out, how the nurse had wrapped him in something that looked like a parachute, how he'd survived when he shouldn't have. His grandfather had lived until 2019, 76 years after Tunisia. He'd married, had children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, all because a nurse had walked into a salvage area at 3 in the morning. Dr. Morrison was an army surgeon now, trauma specialist. He'd served 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq. He'd treated thousands of combat casualties. Every single one had received advanced hemostatic dressings, modern bandages that stopped bleeding through chemical reaction, technology that traced its lineage directly back to Sarah Chen's silk strips. The principle was the same: control bleeding, protect wounds, keep men alive long enough to reach definitive care. The materials had evolved, the chemistry had advanced, but the core innovation remained: find a better way to wrap wounds. Morrison continued through the museum. He stopped at another display, a photograph, black and white, dated January 20th, 1944, General Eisenhower pinning a medal on a young woman in army uniform, Captain Sarah Chen. Morrison had researched her. After his grandfather died, he'd wanted to know more about the woman who'd saved him. He'd found records, reports, statistical analyses from the war, Chen had continued innovating throughout 1944 and 1945. She'd developed triage protocols, improved field surgical techniques, created training programs that reduced combat mortality rates by another 15% beyond the silk bandages. After the war, she'd stayed in the army, she'd risen to lieutenant colonel, she'd taught at the Army Medical School, she'd mentored hundreds of young doctors and nurses, she'd published 17 papers on combat trauma care, she'd changed military medicine. When she died in 1987, the Army Medical Corps had lost one of its greatest innovators. Morrison had attended the memorial service. He'd been 12 years old. His grandfather had taken him. There had been hundreds of people there, former patients, former students, people whose lives Chen had saved directly or indirectly. His grandfather had cried. Morrison remembered that. His grandfather never cried, but he'd cried that day. Morrison left the museum. He walked to the trauma ward. He had surgery scheduled. A sergeant with an IED blast injury, a corporal with a gunshot wound, routine cases, or what passed for routine in military trauma care. He scrubbed in. The sergeant was already on the table. The blast had taken most of his right leg below the knee, massive tissue damage, hemorrhage. The medics had applied hemostatic dressings in the field. The bleeding was controlled. The sergeant would survive, would need months of rehabilitation, would face challenges, but would survive. Morrison removed the field dressings, modern materials, Chiusam-based, chemically designed to promote rapid clotting, light years beyond parachute silk, but the principle was the same: stop the bleeding, protect the wound, give the patient time. He cleaned the wound, prepared it for surgery. Behind him, the surgical team moved with practiced efficiency. Everyone knew their role, everyone executed perfectly. This was the result of 80 years of military medical evolution, of countless innovations, of thousands of doctors and nurses pushing the boundaries of trauma care. But it had started with Sarah Chen, with parachute silk, with one desperate nurse refusing to accept that men had to die. After surgery, Morrison went to his office. He had paperwork, reports, the mundane administrative tasks that filled the spaces between saving lives. His computer screen showed an email from the Army Medical Department, subject Historical Recognition Project. The email explained that the Army was updating its medical training curriculum to include more historical case studies. They wanted to feature Sarah Chen's silk bandaging innovation. They were asking for doctors who had connections to the story to contribute research or personal accounts. Morrison opened a new document. He started typing. He wrote about his grandfather, about Tunisia, about the nurse who'd saved him. He wrote about the legacy, about how Chen's innovation had evolved into modern hemostatic dressings, about how the same principle of refusing to accept limitations still drove military medical innovation today. He wrote about the numbers: 50,000 lives in World War II, estimated 300,000 lives saved by direct evolution of Chen's techniques in subsequent conflicts: Korea, Vietnam, Gulf War, Iraq, Afghanistan. 300,000 soldiers who'd survived because one nurse had found a better way. He wrote for 2 hours. When he finished, he had a comprehensive account: historical context, medical analysis, personal narrative. He attached it to the email response. He sent it. His phone buzzed. Text message from the trauma ward: new patient inbound. Helicopter medevac from training exercise. Multiple casualties. He stood up, grabbed his white coat, headed to the trauma bay. This was the job. This was what Sarah Chen had done, what his grandfather had survived so Morrison could do. The cycle continued. The innovation continued. The commitment to keeping soldiers alive continued. Morrison reached the trauma bay. The helicopter was landing. He could hear the rotors. The doors opened. Medics rushed in carrying stretchers. Morrison moved forward. He saw the wounds, saw the field dressings, modern materials, advanced technology, direct descendants of parachute silk. He started giving orders. His hands moved automatically. Check airway, control bleeding, assess damage. The same steps Chen had followed, the same principles, just better tools. The patient was a young private. Training accident, severe laceration across the thigh. The medic had applied a hemostatic bandage. It was working. The bleeding was controlled. Morrison examined the wound. Deep, clean cut, would need surgery, but the private would survive, would keep his leg, would go home. Get him 2 Morrison ordered, prepped for vascular repair. The team moved. The private was wheeled away. Morrison stood in the empty trauma bay. He thought about his grandfather, about Tunisia, about parachutes cut into strips in the dark, about a nurse who'd saved 50,000 lives because she'd refused to give up. He thought about the young private who'd just been wheeled into surgery, who would survive because 80 years of medical innovation stood between him and death. Innovation that started with Sarah Chen. That moment mattered. That decision mattered. Every life saved mattered. Morrison went to scrub in for surgery. The work continued. The mission continued. Keep them alive. That was the job. That had always been the job. That would always be the job. And somewhere in the history of military medicine, in a display case in a museum, a piece of yellowed parachute silk stood as testament to what one person could do when they refused to accept that soldiers had to die. 14,000 lives in 90 days, 50,000 lives in a war, 300,000 lives, 300,000 lives in 80 years, all because Lieutenant Sarah Chen walked into a salvage area at 3 in the morning and found parachutes, all because she decided that empty supply carts weren't an acceptable reason to watch men bleed out, all because she tried something that seemed silly, that seemed impossible, that seemed like it couldn't possibly work, but did. That was innovation, that was dedication, that was the legacy, and it continued, in every trauma bay, in every field hospital, in every medic. Applying a hemostatic dressing. Under fire, the work continued, the mission continued, the lives saved continued, because of one nurse, one moment, one decision, that changed everything. May 4th, 1943, 2:47 a.m., the sergeant with the chest wound died at 2:33. Sarah had been holding his hand when it happened. His name was Patterson. She learned that from his dog tags. After he stopped breathing, she covered his face with a sheet that should have been used for someone else. Someone still alive. Someone who needed it more. But they were out of sheets too. Holland was still operating. He'd moved on to a private with a belly wound. The chances weren't good. Abdominal wounds rarely were, especially this far from a proper hospital, especially without enough plasma, especially without enough of anything that mattered. Sarah moved through the tent, checking bandages, checking pulses, checking the clock. Morrison's dressing was completely saturated. She could see blood pooling under his cot, soaking into the dirt floor. She had nothing to change it with. She pressed her hand against the wound, felt the hot wetness seeping through her fingers, felt Morrison's leg twitch under her palm. He was still unconscious. That was a mercy. Davis had started shivering. Shock, probably, or infection, or both. His back wounds were exposed now. The last bandage had fallen off an hour ago. She'd tried to reapply it, tried to clean it, tried to make it work. It wouldn't stay. The adhesive was gone. The gauze was too wet. Everything was too wet. Lieutenant Morrison, the other nurse on shift, came over. Her uniform was in worse shape than Sarah's. Her eyes had dark circles under them that looked like bruises. Supply tent, she asked. Sarah shook her head. Morrison didn't ask again. She just nodded and went back to her rounds. There were 3 nurses for 108 men. There had been 4 yesterday, but Lieutenant Chen had collapsed from exhaustion, and they'd sent her to the rear hospital in Algiers. No replacement had arrived yet. No replacement was coming. Sarah checked the clock again. 3:15 a.m., 4 hours, and 45 minutes until dawn, until maybe the convoy arrived, until maybe they got supplies, until maybe she could stop watching men bleed out because she didn't have enough cloth to press against their wound. A corporal near the back of the tent started screaming, not the screaming of pain, the screaming of delirium. Infection had set in. His leg wound had gone septic sometime during the night. Sarah could smell it from across the tent. Gangrene, the smell of rotting meat, the smell of a man dying from the inside out. Holland looked up from his operating table. He met Sarah's eyes. She saw the decision there before he said anything. "Get me a bone saw," Holland said. His voice was flat, empty. The voice of a man who'd made this decision too many times. Sarah found the saw in the instrument cabinet. She carried it to Holland. He took it without looking at her. Hold him down, Holland said to two medics standing nearby. They moved to the corporal's cot. The corporal was still screaming. Sarah turned away. She'd seen amputations before. She didn't need to see another one. She went back to Morrison. His pulse was threadbare. She put her hand on his chest, felt the shallow rise and fall of his breathing. He had maybe 2 hours left, maybe less. She had nothing to save him with. The tent flap opened. A chaplain came in. Captain Williams. He moved through the tent slowly, stopping at each cot, saying prayers, holding hands, offering whatever comfort he could to men who were too far gone to hear him. He stopped at Sarah's side. "How many tonight?" he asked quietly. "4. Sarah, Patterson, Rodriguez, Lewis and Smith." Williams nodded. He'd been at the field hospital for 6 months. He knew the count. He kept track in a small notebook he carried in his pocket. Names and dates. He said it was important to remember them all. Sarah wasn't sure she agreed. Remembering made it harder. Williams moved on. Sarah stayed with Morrison. The bone saw stopped. The screaming stopped. Sarah heard Holland say something to the medics in a low voice. She heard the sound of instruments being dropped into a metal pan. She heard the corporal start crying. That was good. Crying meant conscious. Conscious meant alive. For now, Sarah walked to the supply tent again. She didn't know why. There was nothing there. She'd already checked twice. But she walked there anyway, because standing still felt worse than moving. The tent was dark. She lit a match, held it up. The empty crates stared back at her. She walked around them, looking in corners, checking under things, searching for anything that might help. She found a box of adhesive tape. The tape was old. The adhesive was mostly gone, but it was something. She carried it back to the surgical tent. She used strips of tape to try to hold Davis's bandages in place. They peeled off immediately. The blood was too wet. The skin was too wet. Everything was too wet. She tried again. Same result. She wanted to throw the tape across the tent. She wanted to scream, like the corporal had screamed. She wanted to walk outside and keep walking until the desert swallowed her up, and she didn't have to watch any more men die from something as simple as not having enough cloth. Instead, she sat down on an empty supply crate in the corner. She put her head in her hands. She felt something crack inside her chest. Not breaking, just cracking. A fault line spreading through whatever part of her had been holding everything together. Morrison coughed. A wet, bubbling sound. Sarah looked up. Blood was coming from his mouth now. Internal bleeding. She hadn't seen that before. She stood up. She walked to his cot. She wiped the blood from his lips with the corner of her uniform. She held his hand. She couldn't save him. She couldn't save any of them. Not with empty supply carts and blood-soaked bandages that she had to reuse because there was nothing else. Not with wounds that wouldn't stop bleeding and infections that spread faster than she could cut them out. Not with 47 men who needed her to be better than she was, to have more than she had, to do something that mattered. Morrison's eyes opened. He looked at her. He tried to say something. His lips moved but no sound came out. Sarah squeezed his hand. "You're okay," she laughed. "You're going to be okay." Morrison's eyes closed. His hand went slack in hers. She checked his pulse. Still there. Barely. She looked at the clock. 4:02 a.m. 2 hours and 58 minutes until dawn. May 4th, 1943. 4:47 a.m. Sarah stood outside the surgical tent, watching the sky change from black to deep blue. Dawn was coming. The convoy wasn't. She'd checked with the radio operator 20 minutes ago. No word, no contact, nothing. Behind her, Morrison had stopped breathing at 4:33. That made 5 for the night. She'd covered his face with the same sheet she'd used for Patterson. They were sharing now. Everything was shared. Everything was rationed. Everything was running out. Lieutenant Morrison came outside. She lit a cigarette with shaking hands. "We're down to 37 men in there," she said. "Lost 4 in the last hour." Sarah nodded. She knew. She'd been there for 3 of them. "Holland wants to see you," Morrison said. Sarah went back inside. Holland was at the operating table, washing his hands in a metal basin. The water was pink. He dried his hands on a towel that was more red than white. We need to talk about triage, Holland said. His voice was flat. Empty. The voice of a man who'd run out of options. We don't have supplies for everyone. We need to make decisions about who gets what we have left. Sarah understood. Save the ones who could be saved. Let the others go. Standard combat medicine when resources ran low. Brutal. Necessary. Unacceptable. How long until the convoy, she asked. Holland shook his head. Radio says they hit a minefield outside Mature. 3 trucks lost. They're rerouting. Could be noon. Could be tomorrow. Could be never. Sarah looked at the men in the cots. 37 men. Some would make it to noon. Some wouldn't. Holland's triage would decide which was which. Give me 2 hours, Sarah said. Holland looked at her. 2 hours for what? Sarah didn't answer. She didn't have an answer. Just a desperate need to not stand there and decide who lived and who died, based on how much cloth they had left. She walked out of the surgical tent. She walked past the supply tent. She walked past the motor pool where mechanics were working on a Jeep with a blown transmission. She walked to the far edge of the camp where they stored the salvage. Broken equipment, damaged supplies, things that couldn't be repaired or weren't worth the effort. She'd been here once before, looking for parts for a broken autoclave. The salvage area was a mess. Crates stacked haphazardly. Canvas tarps thrown over piles of metal and wood. A wrecked ambulance with its front end crushed. She started searching. She didn't know what she was looking for, just something. Anything. Cloth. Fabric. Material that could absorb blood and cover wounds and keep men from bleeding out on canvas cots in the middle of the desert. She found a pile of torn uniforms, blood-soaked, unusable. She found a stack of blankets that had been shredded by shrapnel. She found a crate of boots with the soles blown off. She kept searching, behind the wrecked ambulance under a canvas tarp. She found something, parachutes, 6 of them, collapsed, torn, damaged during drops or training jumps. Silk, white silk. She pulled one free from the pile. The canopy was ripped in 3 places. The suspension lines were tangled, but the silk itself was intact, yards and yards of it. She spread it out on the ground. The fabric was thin, light, strong enough to hold a man falling from the sky, maybe strong enough to hold pressure on a wound. She ran back to the surgical tent. Holland was starting his triage rounds. He had a clipboard. He was making notes. Deciding. I need scissors, Sarah said. Holland looked up. What? Scissors. Surgical scissors. The biggest ones we have. Holland pointed to the instrument cabinet. Sarah grabbed 3 pairs of scissors. She ran back to the salvage area. She spread the parachute on the ground. She started cutting. Long strips. 6 inches wide, 8 feet long. She cut through the silk like it was paper. The scissors were sharp. The fabric separated cleanly. She cut for 20 minutes. When she was done, she had 43 strips of parachute silk. She gathered them up. She carried them back to the surgical tent. She dropped them on the supply cart. Holland stared at the pile of white fabric. What is that? Bandages. Sarah. Holland picked up one of the strips. He held it up to the lantern light. The silk was translucent, thin, almost fragile looking. This won't work, Holland said. It's too thin. It won't absorb anything. It'll soak through in minutes. Sarah grabbed the strip from his hand. She walked to Davis's cot. His back wounds were still exposed, still bleeding. She folded the silk strip into a square pad. She pressed it against the largest wound. She held it there, counted to 30, pulled it back. The silk had absorbed the blood, not like gauze, different. The blood didn't soak through. It spread across the surface of the silk, wicked away from the center, dispersed. The wound underneath looked cleaner, less raw. Sarah stared at the silk pad in her hand. She pressed it against the wound again. Same result. The silk absorbed the blood, but stayed mostly white. The blood spread thin across the surface instead of soaking through to her hand. Holland came over. He watched. He took the silk pad from Sarah's hand. He examined it. He looked at the pile of parachute strips on the supply cart. How many do you have? He asked. 43 strips, but there are 5 more parachutes in salvage. I can make 200 strips, maybe 300 if I cut them thinner. Holland was already moving. He grabbed one of the strips. He folded it into a pad. He pressed it against a corporal's arm wound, held it, checked it. The same thing happened. The blood wickered across the silk surface, didn't soak through. Get more, Holland said. Cut all of them. Bring me everything you can carry. Sarah ran back to salvage. She pulled out the remaining 5 parachutes. She spread them on the ground. She started cutting. The sun was coming up now. Orange light spilled across the desert. She could see better. She cut faster. She made the strips thinner, 4 inches wide, still 8 feet long. She could get more from each parachute this way. She worked for an hour. Her hands cramped. Her shoulders ached. She didn't stop. When she was done, she had 267 strips of parachute silk. She carried them back in 3 trips. She dumped them on the supply cart. The pile was enormous, white silk cascading over the edges of the cart. Like a waterfall, Holland was already using the first batch. He'd wrapped Davis's entire back in silk bandages. The wounds were covered. The bleeding had slowed, not stopped, but slowed, visible, measurable. Davis was still shivering, but his pulse was stronger. Morrison came over. She grabbed a handful of silk strips. She started rewrapping the men in her section. The tent filled with the sound of scissors, cutting silk, and nurses, moving quickly between cots. Sarah took a strip to the private. With the shoulder wound, she unwrapped his old gauze bandage. The wound was ugly, deep, still bleeding steadily. She folded the silk into a thick pad. She pressed it over the wound. She wrapped the remaining length of silk around his shoulder and under his arm, tying it off tight. The private opened his eyes. "What is that?" he asked. His voice was rough, dry. "Parachute," Sarah said. The private laughed. It turned into a cough. "I'm being held together by a parachute." "Yeah, does that mean I can fly now?" Sarah smiled. "First time in 19 hours. Let's get you through today first." May 4th, 1943, 8:15 a.m. Holland stood in the center of the surgical tent with his clipboard and a cup of coffee that had gone cold 3 hours ago. He was counting 37 men when he'd started triage. 37 men now, 0 deaths in the last 3 hours. That hadn't happened in 6 days. He walked from cot to cot, checking the silk bandages Sarah had applied. He checked Davis first. The back wounds were covered in white silk wrappings that looked more like something from a mummy than a wounded soldier. Holland carefully peeled back one layer. The wound underneath was clean, not healed, but clean. The bleeding had stopped completely. The tissue around the edges looked less inflamed, less angry. Holland pressed his finger against the skin next to the wound. Davis winced but didn't cry out. No excessive tenderness. That was good. That meant infection hadn't spread. Holland moved to the next cot. Corporal Jenkins. Shrapnel wounds across his chest and arms. Sarah had wrapped him in silk strips that crisscrossed his torso like a white web. Holland checked the largest wound on Jenkins's right arm. Same result. Bleeding stopped. Wound clean. Tissue responding well. He moved to the next cot, and the next, and the next. Same result every time. The silk bandages were working. Better than working. They were keeping the wounds clean, keeping the blood from soaking through, keeping the men alive. Holland walked back to Sarah. She was wrapping a sergeant's leg wound with a fresh strip of silk. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency. Fold the pad, press it against the wound, wrap the remaining length around the fim, tie it off, move to the next patient. "Show me how you're doing this," Holland said. Sarah finished with the sergeant. She picked up a new strip of silk. She demonstrated the folding technique. 4 folds to create a square pad. Press it firmly against the wound. Wrap the rest around the limb to hold it in place. Simple, fast, effective. The silk doesn't absorb like gauze, Sarah explained. It wicks the blood across the surface, spreads it thin, keeps it from pooling, and the weave is tight enough that it keeps the wound protected from dirt and infection. Holland took a strip of silk. He examined it closely. The weave was indeed tight, much tighter than standard gauze. The threads were finer, smoother, less likely to stick to wounds or leave fibers behind. "How much do we have?" Holland asked. 267 strips, enough for everyone here, plus new casualties, and I can make more, if we need them. There are other damaged parachutes in salvage, tents that have been shredded, anything silk or tightly woven cotton. Holland nodded. He looked at his clipboard. He crossed out the triage notes he'd made earlier. Keep going, he said. Wrap everyone. Replace all the gauze bandages with silk. I want to see how this holds up over the next 12 hours. Sarah went back to work. Lieutenant Morrison joined her. Together they moved through the tent, replacing every gauze bandage with silk. The men didn't complain. Some of them joked about being wrapped in parachutes. Some of them asked if it meant they'd survive. Sarah told them yes. She didn't know if it was true, but she told them anyway. By 10:30 a.m., every man in the surgical tent had silk bandages. The pile on the supply cart was significantly smaller. Sarah counted what remained. 93 strips. She needed to make more. She went back to salvage. This time she brought 2 other nurses with her. They pulled out every damaged parachute they could find. 8 more. They spread them on the ground. They started cutting. They worked in silence. The only sound was scissors through silk, and the distant rumble of artillery to the north. The Germans were still out there, still fighting, still sending more wounded men to field hospitals that didn't have enough supplies to save them. By noon they'd cut another 400 strips. Sarah carried them back to the surgical tent in a canvas bag. She dumped them on the supply cart. The pile was enormous again, white silk everywhere. Holland was checking bandages again. He'd been doing rounds every hour, documenting the results, making notes on his clipboard. Sarah watched him work. He was meticulous, thorough. He checked every bandage, every wound, every patient. When he finished, he came over to Sarah. I need to show you something, he said. He led her to Davis's cot. He carefully unwrapped the silk bandages from Davis's back. The wounds were visible, still there, still healing, but drastically improved from this morning. The inflammation was down, the redness had faded, the tissue was starting to granulate. Healthy tissue, new growth. This is 12 hours of healing, Holland said. Normally we'd see this kind of improvement in 3 or 4 days, if we saw it at all. He rewrapped Davis's back with fresh silk. He moved to another cot. He unwrapped the bandages. Same result. Accelerated healing, clean wounds, healthy tissue. I don't know why it's working, Holland said. Maybe it's the tight weave keeping infection out. Maybe it's the silk itself having some property we don't understand. Maybe it's just luck, but it's working. He turned to Sarah. We need to document this, photograph the wounds, write detailed notes on the application technique. This needs to get back to command. If we can replicate this in other field hospitals, we can save thousands of men. Sarah nodded. She felt something strange in her chest, not the crack from earlier, something else, something lighter, hope maybe, or just exhaustion. She wasn't sure. The tent flap opened. A medic came in carrying a private on his back. Fresh casualty, gunshot wound to the leg. The medic laid the private on an empty cot. Blood was everywhere. Sarah grabbed a strip of silk. She folded it into a pad. She pressed it against the wound. She wrapped the leg. She tied it off. The bleeding slowed immediately, not stopped, but slowed enough that she could see the wound, could assess the damage, could determine treatment. Holland came over. He examined the wound, through the silk bandage. He nodded. Surgery, he said, but he'll make it. The private looked up at Sarah. His face was pale, sweating, in shock. What did you wrap me with? He asked. Parachute, Sarah said. Am I going to die? No, Sarah said, and this time she believed. May 6, 1943, Field Hospital 28. Colonel Brennan arrived without warning at 1400 hours. He was the chief medical officer for the entire North African theater, tall, grey-haired, 3 rows of ribbons on his chest. He walked into the surgical tent with 2 captains following behind him, both carrying cameras and notebooks. Holland snapped to attention. Sarah and the other nurses stopped what they were doing. Everyone in the tent who could stand did. At ease, Brennan said. His voice carried authority but not arrogance. Major Holland, I received your report about a new bandaging technique. I came to see it for myself. Holland gestured to the supply cart where silk strips were stacked in neat piles. We're using parachute silk, sir, cut into strips, applied directly to wounds. The results have been significant. Brennan picked up one of the strips. He held it up to the light. He examined the weave. He set it down. Show me, he said. Holland led Brennan to Davis's cot. Davis was sitting up now. His color had returned. The grey pallor of shock had faded. Holland unwrapped the silk bandages from Davis's back. The wounds were healing. Visible improvement from even yesterday. The tissue was pink and healthy. New skin was forming at the edges. Brennan leaned in close. He examined the wounds without touching them. He straightened up. How long since injury? 5 days, Holland said. Shrapnel wounds, deep tissue damage, multiple fragment penetrations. We had no gauze left when we started using the silk 3 days ago. Brennan looked at the wounds again. He looked at Holland. 3 days and you have this level of healing? Yes, sir. Brennan moved to the next cot. Holland unwrapped those bandages. Same result. Healthy healing. Clean wounds. Brennan moved through the entire tent. He examined 12 different patients. He asked questions. How was the silk applied? How often were the bandages changed? What was the infection rate? What was the mortality rate since implementation? Holland answered every question. Sarah stood nearby with her notes, detailed documentation of every patient, every wound, every bandage application, every outcome. When Brennan finished his examination, he turned to Sarah. You're the one who developed this technique? Yes, sir. Walk me through it. Sarah picked up a strip of silk. She demonstrated the folding technique, the pad creation, the wrapping method, the tying technique. She explained how the silk wickeded blood across the surface instead of absorbing it through layers, how the tight weave protected wounds from contamination, how the smooth texture prevented fibers from adhering to damaged tissue. Brennan watched intently. When she finished, he nodded. Do it on me, he said. He rolled up his sleeve. He had an old scar on his forearm, a jagged line from something that had cut deep years ago. Sarah folded a strip of silk. She wrapped it around Brennan's arm. She demonstrated the proper tension. Not too tight, not too loose, just enough to hold the pad in place without restricting circulation. Brennan examined the bandage on his arm. He flexed his fingers, rotated his wrist, tested the range of motion. Doesn't restrict movement, he said. That's important. Men can still function with these on. He unwrapped the bandage. He handed it back to Sarah. He turned to one of the captains following him. Photograph everything. The supplies, the technique, the wounds, the healing. I want complete documentation. The captain with the camera started shooting. Flash bulbs popped. The other captain took notes. Brennan turned back to Holland. What's your supply situation? We have approximately 600 strips ready to use. Lieutenant Chen has been cutting more from salvaged parachute. We estimate we can produce another 1,000 strips from available materials here at this hospital. Not enough, Brennan said. I'm going to need this technique implemented across all field hospitals in the theater. That's 47 hospitals, approximately 8,000 wounded men at any given time. He paused, calculated. We'll need to requisition every damaged parachute in North Africa, strip them, cut them, distribute them. I want a full supply chain set up within 2 weeks. He looked at Sarah. Lieutenant Chen, you're coming with me. We're going to Field Hospital 64 in Algiers. You're going to train their medical staff on this technique. Then Hospital 81 in Oran. Then we're going back to Cairo to brief the entire Mediterranean command structure. Sarah felt her stomach drop. She looked at Holland. Holland nodded. Sir, with respect, I'm needed here, Sarah said. We still have 37 critical patients requiring constant care. Major Holland can handle it now that he knows the technique. Brennan said, what I need is someone who can teach this to 400 nurses and medics across 7 countries in the next month. That's you. He turned to the captains. Get me transport. I want Lieutenant Chen on a plane to Algiers by 1800 hours. The captains left the tent. Brennan turned back to Sarah. Pack your gear. You're about to become very busy. Sarah packed in 20 minutes. 1 duffel bag, 2 uniforms, her medical kit, a folder of documentation on the silk bandaging technique. She said goodbye to Lieutenant Morrison at the tent entrance. Morrison hugged her. You did something incredible here, Morrison said. Sarah didn't feel incredible. She felt tired and worried about leaving the men in the surgical tent. and overwhelmed by the idea of training 400 people in 4 weeks. Keep them alive, Sarah said. That's the plan, Morrison replied. The plane was a C-47 transport. Sarah sat in the cargo hold on a canvas seat surrounded by supply crates and mail bags. The engines roared. The plane lifted off. Through the small window she watched Field Hospital 228 disappear into the desert. She thought about Morrison, about Davis, about the 37 men in silk bandages who were alive because she'd walked into the salvage area and found parachutes. She thought about the thousands of men in other hospitals who were bleeding out on canvas cots because they didn't have parachutes. She opened her folder. She reviewed her notes. She prepared to teach. May 9, 1943. Field Hospital 64, Algiers. The training room was packed. 63 nurses and medics sat on folding chairs arranged in rows. Every eye was on Sarah. She stood at the front of the room next to a demonstration table. A private named Kowalski sat on the table. He'd volunteered. He had a healing shrapnel wound on his shoulder, perfect for demonstration. Sarah held up a strip of parachute silk. "This is your new bandage," she said. Her voice carried across the room, loud, clear, confident. She didn't feel confident. She felt like an imposter, like someone pretending to be an expert when 3 days ago she'd been desperately cutting up parachutes in the dark. But Colonel Brennan was standing in the back of the room, watching, and 63 medical professionals were waiting for her to teach them how to save lives. So she taught. "Standard gauze absorbs blood through vertical wicking," Sarah explained. "The blood soaks down through multiple layers. This creates saturation. Saturation leads to seepage. Seepage requires frequent changing. We don't have enough gauze for frequent changing. The silk solves this problem." She demonstrated on Kowalski's shoulder. She unwrapped his existing gauze bandage. The wound was clean, healing well. She folded a strip of silk into a square pad, 4 folds. She pressed the pad against the wound. The silk wicks blood horizontally across the surface. She continued. "The blood spreads thin, doesn't saturate through. This means the bandage stays effective longer. You change it once every 12 to 24 hours instead of every 4 to 6. She wrapped the remaining length of silk around Kowalski's shoulder. She demonstrated the proper tension, the tying technique. "Questions?" Sarah asked. A hand went up. "Captain Morris, trauma surgeon, 20 years experience." "What about infection rates?" Morris asked. "The tight weave provides barrier protection," Sarah said. "We've seen infection rates drop by approximately 60% compared to standard gauze in field conditions. The silk doesn't leave fibers in the wound, doesn't adhere to damaged tissue, easier to remove during dressing changes." Another hand, Lieutenant Foster, head nurse. "How do we maintain sterility?" "Same protocols as gauze," Sarah said. "Autoclave the silk strips before use. If autoclaving isn't available, boil them for 20 minutes. The silk holds up to repeated sterilization better than gauze. We've sterilized the same strips 5 times without degradation." More hands went up. Sarah answered every question. Supply chain concerns, application variations for different wound types, storage requirements, cost comparisons. She'd prepared for this. She'd spent the entire plane ride memorizing data from Holland's reports. She had numbers, statistics, evidence. After an hour of questions, she moved to practical demonstrations. She divided the room into groups of 4. Each group received strips of silk and a volunteer patient with various healing wounds. She walked between the groups, correcting technique, answering questions, demonstrating again when needed. A corporal in the 3rd group struggled with the folding. Sarah knelt beside him. She took his hands. She guided them through the fold. 4 equal sections, she said. Firm creases. The pad needs to maintain its shape under pressure. The corporal tried again. Better. Not perfect, but better. Sarah moved to the next group. A nurse was wrapping too tight. The patient's fingers were turning white. Sarah gently loosened the bandage. "You should be able to slip one finger under the wrap," she explained. "Tight enough to hold, loose enough to allow circulation." The nurse adjusted. The patient's color returned. By 1600 hours, every person in the room could properly apply a silk bandage. Sarah watched them work, saw the confidence building, saw the technique spreading from person to person like a ripple across water. Colonel Brennan approached. Field Hospital 81 tomorrow, he said. 74 medical staff. Then Hospital 92 in Tunis. Then 3 hospitals in Sicily. The invasion starts in July. I want every medic going ashore trained in this technique before they land. Sarah nodded. She was already exhausted. The idea of training hundreds more people felt impossible. But she didn't say that. She just nodded. That night she slept in a tent behind the hospital. Her dreams were filled with blood-soaked parachutes and empty supply carts. She woke and couldn't fall back asleep. She got up. She walked to the supply tent. A private was on duty. He was cutting parachute silk into strips. He'd been trained yesterday. Now he was producing supplies. Sarah watched him work. His hands moved efficiently. Fold, measure, cut, stack. He looked up, saw her watching. Lieutenant Chen, he said. Yes. I just wanted to say thank you, he said. My brother is at Field Hospital 28 in Tunisia. He was wounded last week. The convoy bringing supplies got hit. He would have died, but your technique saved him. Sarah felt something tighten in her throat. She nodded. She couldn't speak. The private went back to cutting. Sarah went back to her tent. She sat on her cot. She thought about Morrison, about Davis, about all the men she'd wrapped in parachute silk, about all the men she'd never meet who were alive, because of something she'd figured out in desperation at 3 in the morning. She thought about her brother's friend at Field Hospital 28. She wondered if it was Morrison, or Davis, or one of the 37 others. She wondered if she'd ever know. She picked up her folder. She reviewed her notes for tomorrow's training. Field Hospital 81, 74 people. She needed to be ready. July 10, 1943, Sicily. Operation Husky. The landing craft hit the beach at 0245 hours. The ramp dropped. Corporal Martinez was the first medic off. He carried a canvas bag filled with silk bandages. The bag was heavy. 60 strips. He'd cut them himself back at the staging area in Tunisia. Behind him, infantry poured onto the sand. Machine gun fire came from the ridge. Mortars. Artillery. Men started falling. Martinez ran toward the first casualty. Private Henderson. Shot through the leg. Femoral artery. Blood spurting with each heartbeat. Martinez dropped to his knees. He pulled out a silk strip. He folded it fast. Years of practice. Months of training. 3 seconds to create the pad. He jammed it against the wound. Pressed hard. Henderson screamed. Martinez kept pressing. Counted to 30. The bleeding slowed. He wrapped the silk around Henderson's thigh. Pulled it tight. Tied it off. "You're good," Martinez said. "Stay down. Evac team will get you." He moved to the next casualty. Sergeant Brooks. Shrapnel across the chest. Multiple wounds. Martinez used 3 silk strips, 1 for each major wound. He worked fast. Fold, press, wrap, tie, move. The beach was chaos. Smoke, noise, men running, men falling, men screaming. Martinez moved through it all. His hands steady, his mind focused. Each casualty got silk bandages. Each wound got covered. The infection rate for beach landings was typically catastrophic. Sand, salt water, contamination everywhere. But the silk kept the wounds protected, kept the bleeding controlled, kept men alive long enough for evac. By 400 hours Martinez had used 43 of his 60 silk strips. He'd bandaged 19 men. All 19 were still alive. The infantry pushed inland. Martinez followed. He moved with the advance. More casualties. A lieutenant, a corporal, 2 privates hit by the same shell. Martinez bandaged them all. He ran out of silk strips at 0530. He found another medic. Borrowed 10 strips. Kept working. The sun came up. The beach behind them was covered with wounded men waiting for evac. Every single one had white silk bandages. Some had 3, some had 5, Some were wrapped head to toe. They looked like mummies, but they were alive. At narrow 800 hours, Lieutenant Chen came ashore with the medical supply convoy. Sarah. She'd been training medics for 2 months. Now she was here, on the beach, watching her technique save lives in real time. She walked through the rows of wounded men. She checked bandages. She saw the silk doing its job. Blood wicked across the surface. Wounds stayed clean despite the sand and water. Men who should have died were waiting for transport back to the field hospitals. A captain approached her. Medical corps. Exhausted. Covered in blood that wasn't his. "Lieutenant Chen?" he asked. "Yes, Captain Reynolds. Field Hospital set. We're set up 2 miles inland. We need you to come with us. We're about to be overwhelmed, and we need someone who knows how to manage supplies." Sarah followed Reynolds inland. The field hospital was 3 large tents in an olive grove. Wounded men were already arriving. Dozens of them, stretchers everywhere. The hospital staff was working frantically. Sarah went to the supply tent. She found crates of parachute silk, pre-cut strips. Thousands of them, shipped from Algiers, from Cairo, from every supply depot in the Mediterranean. She organized the distribution. She set up stations. She assigned nurses to each station. She created a system: triage, initial bandaging, surgical prep, post-op care. Each station had adequate silk supplies. Each nurse knew the technique. The system worked. By noon, they'd processed 147 casualties. The mortality rate was 18%. Before the silk bandaging technique, it would have been 40%, maybe 50. Sarah did the math in her head. 147 casualties, 40% mortality would have been 59 dead. 18% was 26 dead. The silk had saved 33 lives. Just at this one hospital, just in 6 hours. There were 12 field hospitals supporting the Sicily invasion. If the numbers held across all of them, the silk bandages would save approximately 400 lives today. 400 men who would go home to their families. 400 men who would survive because Sarah had walked into a salvage area 2 months ago and found parachutes. Reynolds came over. "We need more supplies," he said. "We're going through silk faster than anticipated. The wounds are extensive." Sarah checked the supply crates. They had enough for another 12 hours. Maybe 18 if they were careful. "I'll radio back to Algiers," Sarah said. "Get them to push more supplies forward. How many strips do you need per day?" "At this rate, 3,000, maybe 4,000 once the main assault moves inland, and we start getting casualties from the interior fighting." Sarah did more math. 4,000 strips per hospital. 12 hospitals. 48,000 strips per day. Each parachute produced approximately 45 strips. That meant they needed over 1,000 parachutes per day. Every damaged parachute in the theater wasn't enough. They'd need to start requisitioning new parachutes, cutting them up before they were ever used for jumps. That would require approval from command. Priority allocation. Supply chain restructuring. Sarah found Colonel Brennan. He'd come ashore with the second wave. He was at the communications tent. "Sir, we have a supply problem," Sarah said. She explained the numbers, the requirements, the shortage. Brennan listened. He nodded. "I'll handle it," he said. "You focus on keeping these hospitals running. I'll get you the supplies." He picked up the radio. He started making calls. Sarah went back to the surgical tent. She checked on the patients. She saw silk bandages everywhere, white fabric covering wounds, protecting tissue, saving lives. She thought about Field Hospital 28, about Morrison and Davis and the 37 men she'd wrapped in parachutes. She wondered if they knew what had happened, if they knew that their survival had led to this, to thousands of men being saved across an entire theater of war. She wondered if anyone would remember, or if this would just be a footnote in some medical journal, a small innovation during a big war. She decided it didn't matter. The men were alive. That was September 15, 1943, Medical Command Headquarters, Cairo, Egypt. The conference room was full. 32 senior medical officers from every theater of the war, Europe, Pacific, Africa, Mediterranean. They sat around a long wooden table covered with reports and statistical analyses. Colonel Brennan stood at the head of the table. Behind him a board displayed charts and graphs, numbers, data, evidence. "Gentlemen," Brennan began, "I'm here to present the results of a medical innovation that has fundamentally changed our combat mortality rates in the Mediterranean theater. Over the past 90 days we have implemented a new bandaging technique across all field hospitals supporting operations in Sicily and Italy. The results are significant." He pointed to the first chart, mortality rates. Before and after. Prior to June 1st, our field hospital mortality rate for combat wounds was 38%. This included all casualties requiring hospitalization, gunshot wounds, shrapnel, burns, blast injuries, all categories. He moved his pointer to the second column. After implementation of silk bandaging techniques on June 1st, our mortality rate dropped to 21%. That's a 45% reduction in deaths. Over 90 days across 47 field hospitals, this technique has saved approximately 10,200 lives that would have been lost under previous protocols. The room was silent. 32 officers stared at the number. General Morrison, Chief Medical Officer for European Operations, leaned forward. "Colonel, these numbers seem impossible. You're telling me that changing bandages reduced mortality by almost half?" "Yes, sir," Brennan said, "but it's not just changing bandage. It's changing how we think about wound management in resource-limited environments. Let me walk you through the mechanism." He moved to the next chart. Infection rate. Standard gauze bandages in field conditions have an infection rate of approximately 67% within 48 hours of application. The desert environment, the humidity in Italy, the lack of sterile conditions, all contribute to rapid bacterial contamination. Infected wounds require aggressive treatment, amputation, debridement, extended hospital stays. Many result in death. He pointed to the second column. Silk bandages have an infection rate of 23% under identical conditions. The tight weave creates a barrier against environmental contamination. The horizontal wicking of blood keeps the wound surface drier. Drier wounds are less susceptible to bacterial growth. Reduced infection means reduced mortality. General Morrison was still skeptical. "What about supply costs? Parachute silk is expensive. Gauze is cheap. Are we really saving money here?" "Excellent question," Brennan said. He moved to the next chart. Cost analysis. A standard gauze bandage costs 3 cents. It needs to be changed every 4 to 6 hours in field conditions. That's 4 to 6 bandages per day per wound. For a typical combat casualty, with multiple wounds requiring a 10-day hospital stay, we use approximately 240 gauze bandages. Total cost $7.20 per patient. He pointed to the second column. A silk bandage strip costs 12 cents to produce. We cut them from damaged or surplus parachutes. Each strip lasts 12 to 24 hours. That's 1 to 2 changes per day. For the same 10-day hospital stay, we use approximately 15 silk bandages. Total cost $1.80 per patient. The silk bandages cost 75% less per patient, while delivering superior outcomes. The room murmured. Officers flipped through the reports in front of them. Numbers, evidence, proof. Admiral Stevens, Pacific Fleet Medical Command, raised his hand. "Do these results translate to the Pacific Theater? Our environment is different. Jungle conditions, high humidity, different bacterial profiles." "We believe so," Brennan said. "The mechanism of action should be consistent across environments. The tight weave barrier protection works regardless of bacterial species. The horizontal wicking works regardless of humidity levels. We're recommending immediate implementation across all theaters pending Pacific-specific trials." He moved to the final chart. Projected impact. "If we implement silk bandaging across all theaters of operation, our modeling suggests we can save approximately 50,000 lives per year. 50,000 soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines who will survive their wounds and return home. 50,000 families who will not receive death notifications. 50,000 men who will live because we changed how we wrap bandages." The room was silent again. 50,000 lives. The number was staggering. General Morrison stood up. He walked to the board. He studied the chart. He turned to Brennan. Who developed this technique? Lieutenant Sarah Chen, Army Nurse Corps. She was assigned to Field Hospital 28 in Tunisia. When their supply convoy was destroyed, they ran out of gauze. She improvised using parachute silk from salvage. When the technique proved effective, I had her train medical staff across the entire Mediterranean theater. Morrison nodded. I want her promoted to captain. I want her assigned to my staff as Chief of Medical Innovation. And I want her technique standardized across every medical facility in the European theater. By December 1st, he looked around the room. Gentlemen, we're in the business of winning wars and bringing our men home alive. This technique does both. I'm implementing it immediately. I suggest you all do the same. The other officers nodded. Admiral Stevens stood. Pacific Fleet will begin implementation next week. I'll need Lieutenant Chen to train our medical staff. Captain Chen, Morrison corrected. She's promoted effective immediately. Brennan smiled. I'll inform her, sir. The meeting continued for 2 more hours. Supply chain discussions, training protocols, implementation timelines. By the time the officers left, silk bandaging was official policy for all United States military medical facilities worldwide. Brennan walked back to his office. He picked up the phone. He called Field Hospital 76 in Italy, where Sarah was currently stationed. The operator connected him. Captain Chen, he said when she answered. Yes, sir. You've been promoted, effective immediately. You're now the Chief of Medical Innovation for European Operations. General Morrison wants you in London by next week. There was silence on the other end of the line. Then Sarah's voice, quiet, uncertain. Sir, I'm just a nurse who cut up some parachutes. You're a captain who saved 10,000 lives, Brennan said. There's a difference. Pack your gear. You have a plane to catch. He hung up. He looked at the charts on his wall, the numbers, the evidence. 10,000 lives saved in 90 days, 50,000 lives projected over the next year. All because one exhausted nurse had walked into a salvage area at 3 in the morning and refused to accept that men had to die because they'd run out of cloth. January 20th, 1944. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, London. Captain Sarah Chen stood in her dress uniform outside the ceremony hall. Her shoes were polished, her buttons gleamed, her hands were shaking. Inside the hall, 200 officers and enlisted personnel waited. Outside, Sarah tried to remember how to breathe. Colonel Brennan came out. He saw her standing there, frozen, nervous. He asked. Terrified, Sarah admitted. Good, Brennan said. That means you understand what's happening in there. Come on, they're waiting. He held the door. Sarah walked inside. The hall was massive, high ceilings, wood paneling, flags from every Allied nation hanging along the walls. 200 people stood at attention. Sarah walked down the center aisle. Her footsteps echoed. She reached the front. General Eisenhower stood on a raised platform, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe. He waited while Sarah climbed the steps. She stopped in front of him, saluted. Eisenhower returned the salute. Captain Chen, he said. His voice carried across the hall, clear, authoritative. You are here today because you did something remarkable. In May of 1943, during operations in Tunisia, you developed a medical technique that has fundamentally changed how we treat combat wounds. Your innovation has saved an estimated 14,300 lives as of this morning. That number continues to grow every day. He paused. Let the number sink in. 14,000 soldiers who will return home to their families. 14,000 men who survived wounds that would have killed them under previous medical protocol. 14,000 lives saved because you refused to accept the limitations of your supply situation and found a better way. He picked up a small velvet box from the table beside him. He opened it. Inside was a medal, bronze star, for meritorious achievement in connection with military operations against an enemy of the United States, for developing and implementing life-saving medical innovations under combat conditions, for extraordinary dedication to the preservation of human life. He pinned the medal to Sarah's uniform. He stepped back. He saluted. Sarah saluted back. The hall erupted in applause. 200 people clapping. Sarah stood there, overwhelmed, trying not to cry. Eisenhower leaned close. You should know, he said quietly. Your technique is being adopted by British forces, Canadian forces, Even the Soviets have asked for training materials. You've changed military medicine for every army in this war. That's worth more than any medal." He stepped back, shook her hand. The ceremony continued. Awards for other personnel, promotions, commendations. Sarah barely heard any of it. She kept thinking about Field Hospital 28, about Morrison's blood-soaked cot, about the empty supply cart, about the desperate walk to salvage at 3 in the morning. After the ceremony there was a reception. Officers congratulated Sarah, shook her hand, thanked her. She smiled, said thank you, felt like an imposter. A captain from the medical corps approached. He introduced himself as Captain Walsh, trauma surgeon, 15 years experience. "I wanted to tell you something," Walsh said. "I was at Omaha Beach, D-Day. I treated over 300 casualties in the first 48 hours. Every single one of them got your silk bandages. Every single one. The infection rate was the lowest I've ever seen in my career. The mortality rate was half what we expected. You saved lives on that beach. Men I never met. Men who will never know your name. But they're alive because of you." Sarah felt the tightness in her throat return. She nodded, couldn't speak. Walsh saluted, walked away. Sarah found a quiet corner. She needed a moment. Needed to process. Colonel Brennan found her there. "You okay?" he asked. "I keep thinking about all the men who died before June 1st. Sarah said. "All the men I couldn't save because I didn't figure it out sooner." Brennan sat down beside her. "You can't think that way. You can't carry the weight of everyone who died before you found the solution. You found it as fast as any human could. Faster, probably. Most people would have just accepted the empty sassy cart and done triage and moved on. You didn't. You found another way." He stood up. "There's someone here who wants to meet you." He led Sarah across the room. A major was waiting. Army Air Corps, pilot wings on his chest. "Captain Chen," Brennan said. "This is Major Davis. You wrapped his wounds in Tunisia." Sarah stared. Davis. The back wounds. The shrapnel. The man she'd bandaged with the first silk strips. He was here, alive, walking, smiling. "Lieutenant Chen," Davis said. "Sorry, Captain Chen. I wanted to say thank you. I was bleeding out on that cot. I remember you wrapping me in something white. I remember thinking it looked like a parachute. Then I passed out. I woke up 3 days later. The doctors said I shouldn't have survived, but I did. Because of you." He extended his hand. Sarah shook it. "You're flying again?" she asked. "Bomber Command," Davis said. "B-17s. I've done 43 missions since Sicily. 43 missions I wouldn't have flown if you hadn't wrapped me in that parachute." He released her hand. "I'm not the only one. There are thousands of us, men who are alive and fighting. Because you figured out how to keep us breathing when the supplies ran out. That matters. Don't forget that." He saluted. Walked away. Sarah stood there, surrounded by people, surrounded by congratulations and medals and recognition, but all she could think about was Morrison, and the 47 men in that tent, and the empty supply car, and the moment she'd decided to walk to salvage instead of giving up. That moment had mattered. That decision had mattered. She'd saved 14,000 lives. But it had started with just one. Morrison. The first man she'd wrapped in silk. The first life she'd refused to let slip away. She wondered if he knew. If anyone had told him. If he understood that his survival had led to all of this. She decided to find out. After the reception, she went to the communications office. She sent a message to Field Hospital asking about Morrison, asking if he was alive. The response came back 3 hours later. Private Morrison had survived. He'd been sent to a rear hospital in Algiers, then to a recovery facility in England, then home to Chicago. He'd been discharged in October with full honors. He was alive. Sarah sat in her quarters that night, her medal on the desk. The message about Morrison in her hand. She thought about the last 8 months. About the training. About Sicily. About the thousands of men wrapped in white silk. About the numbers. 14,000 lives. She'd done that. Not alone. But she'd started it. She'd found the solution when everyone else had given up. She thought about what came next. The war wasn't over. Men were still bleeding. Still dying. still needing someone to figure out how to save them. She was chief of medical innovation now. That meant more than silk bandages. That meant finding other solutions, other ways to keep men alive, other moments at 3 in the morning when someone had to walk into salvage and find something that everyone else had missed. She could do that. She would do that, because that's what the job required, and because 14,000 men deserved someone who wouldn't stop trying.